honored to introduce you today to Dave Evans, a friend of the ministry for a while now. Dave is not only the co-founder of the Stanford Life Design Lab, but he's also a New York Times bestselling author of Designing Your Life, Designing Your Work Life, and I think he's in the final edits of Designing Your New Work Life. So Dave, thanks so much for joining us today.
Lindsay, thanks for having me. Good to be here again. Okay, well, thanks for the invitation to be here. I'm really glad to be in the conversation. And again, we're going to start by talking about what is this design thinking stuff. I mean, if you want to learn about what design thinking has to teach the church, well, what is it? So I've got a little presentation to get into that. Let's take a look. It looks like this. We are talking about churchianity, kind of the way we do the gospel, versus the gospel itself. What does design thinking have to teach us? And so I'm going to now try to cram about a semester 60-hour course into about 10 minutes, but here we go. The topic that came up around what might be interesting about design thinking is relative to what does the Western church have to learn from the global church, which I have framed, churchianity versus the gospel. What's design thinking have to teach us? And I will leave, till the end, what do I mean by churchianity? So specifically, if we want to learn to think a little differently, to think like a designer, I'm going to now give you a semester course in design thinking in about 10 minutes. When we talk about design thinking, first of all, what's that term even mean? Where does it come from? Design thinking is the fairly recent, less than 15 years old, renaming of an innovation methodology originally developed at Stanford University starting back in 1963. The design program at Stanford, in which I am a teaching lecturer. I'm not a professor. People get that wrong all the time. I don't have a PhD. I'm barely legally allowed to teach. I'm just a Philistine with a master's degree. Design thinking is the new name that David Kelly, our senior leader at Stanford, gave to a process called human-centered design, HCD. And that's still technically the right name for what it is we're talking about this morning. David renamed it because when you talk about design, people often think about what I consider craft design, design like graphic design, industrial design, car design, ergonomic design. We were talking earlier about our prior lives as product managers, and when you're doing product design, that's a different kind of a thing where you're shaping stuff and drawing stuff and what have you. You can get a master's in design at Stanford and still be lousy at drawing. And a craft designer would think about, what? That doesn't make any sense. So human-centered design is an innovation methodology for coming up with a cool idea and trying to do something differently than you would have before. And it's a way of thinking about things. You don't have to have a specific design craft. What you have is a design methodology. So that's the first thing. It's just a way of thinking. You can think a different kind of a way. So lots of people can be design thinkers. So first thing about what is design thinking is it's a way of doing things. And it's easiest understood, first of all, by realizing, wait a minute, we think lots of different ways. So what are some of the different ways we think? And design thinking is almost easier to understand by knowing what it's not. So we have engineering thinking, and I have 2 engineering degrees. Engineering is wonderful stuff. Engineering is applied science. And what do we do in engineering is we work on things called tame problems. That's a technical term, a well-bounded problem about which we understand what the thing is, what we want to change. We know all the information about what we're working with, and we have the equations, and we have the tables, and we have the graphs, and we can do this thing in a very repeatable, predictable way. We can solve the problem. So when I build that bridge over the river, I know how many cars I want to carry, how strong the steel is. I know how long I want to wait till it rusts away. I got that all figured out. I can build that bridge and it's going to work fine. And I can build it over another bridge. It will work exactly the same way. That's engineering thinking. And it's wonderful, but of course, it's not the only thing in the world. Then we got business thinking. Well, boy, and business thinking is very popular. The largest country in the world by far is capitalism. Right. That's and probably the second biggest one is soccer. But the biggest thing going on in the world is the economy, the global economy. And in business, what do? Well, you're never done and you're never right as a business person. The customer never loves you quite enough. Your systems are never quite efficient enough. Even if you're trying to be, more healthy and green these days, your supply chain is never green or ecological enough. Your diversity is never inclusive enough. You're always going to get better. And if you can get better, hopefully you can get better in an organized, rigorous way. You can go to business school and get a PhD in this stuff and learn how to do it quantitatively with lots of numbers. But although at time we're trying to get better and we're optimizing our way forward. And optimization is never done, but it continues to work in a certain kind of a vector. And business people just think like that. Researchers, I hang out at a research university, and researchers invent new knowledge in a highly structured, rigorous way. There's a methodology for how knowledge is allowed to be created. If you want to be a tenured faculty member at a research institution, you have to jump through some hoops. You have to prove you know how to do what you're doing. Getting a PhD, literally, the process of a PhD, your dissertation, is the creation of a new piece of rigorous information that was not there before. You're near the end of your dissertation as a PhD candidate when you get to the place where you ask a question and your advisor tells you, you know what, Lindsay? Nobody could answer that question but you, because it's never been answered before. Now you're on the edge of new knowledge. And if you can prove that the thing you're about to think of is rigorously demonstrable, that's real knowledge. You've now created knowledge in a legitimate way. You are one of the research club people. You get the funny hat, the 3 stripes on your suit, and off you go. You're now a member of the academy. And we do that analytically. It's an analyzation process, and it's very rigorous. So we know how to solve things as engineers, we know how to optimize things as business people, know how to analyze stuff as researchers. And these are super powerful tools which have brought us the modern world most of us live in today. So it's very easy to default. And there's the old line, the devil's got all the good tunes, historically, in terms of ways of thinking or innovation or organizational development processes, all that kind of stuff. The church tends to follow the world, unfortunately. The innovators often are in the world, and the church goes, ooh, we could do that, So we'll learn how to be more organizationally efficient, and then we'll think up seeker church as a way to do that instead, So the church tends to follow. And then there's one more way of thinking we call design thinking, where we build our way forward. And specifically, design thinking works on a thing called wicked problems versus tame problems. And a wicked problem, which again is a technical term, is a problem where it's a really messy definition of a problem. You don't actually know what it is you're working on until you find it. And when you find it and you work on it, what you have is a completely customized solution that cannot be replicated elsewhere because it's so unique to that situation and that context. And while you're searching for it, you recognize that you don't know what you're doing because you can't, because it's never been done before. And in that situation, you can't analyze it because you don't have any information. You can't research the way it works because you're mostly trying to build this thing we've never seen before called the future, and there's no data available. You can't optimize it because it's never been here. And you can't engineer it because there's not enough information to know how to get it right. And there is no getting it right. There's just getting it in an appropriate to that situation. Well, wicked problems are really human problems, nice, messy human problems. Human beings are human problems. And certainly doing church is a wicked problem. Church is really hard to do. So that's the essential nature of design thinking. And what defines it are 2 things. Mindsets and a process. So the mindsets, this is sort of the way designers walk around the world, their point of view, their framework, are these core ways of being in the world. Radical collaboration, reframing, curiosity, mindfulness of process, bias toward action, and storytelling. And by the way, when you start going through this stuff, there are people like Todd Bolsinger go, ooh, this is profoundly Christian stuff. And it really starts with curiosity. And curiosity really is the pursuit of latent wonderfulness. What it really means is, ooh, that looks like I'm going to presuppose what's going on over there is really interesting. I wonder what it is. What do the people who think that's interesting know that I don't know? Which, by the way, is exactly the way God looks at reality. In the realm of contemplative Christian spirituality, Thomas Merton, famous monk, would define contemplation as taking a long and loving look at the real. And you keep taking that long, loving look until you see the real the way God sees it. And when you see it, what you see is what God loves in. And God loves the entire creation. So until you've seen what's lovable, you haven't seen it. And that's where designers start. And curiosity really is that human characteristic that that longing of the imago Dei in your soul that knows there's what it knows is the glory of God is over there somewhere. Let's go take a look. So that's the engine that drives this whole process. And then from there, you go to radical collaboration, which doesn't mean collaborating with radicals. What it means is I'm radically inclusive. I need to go hear from everybody. That curiosity insatiably wants to hear everyone's voice, right? And, a liberation theologian from South America would tell you, until you have heard the voice of the widow, the poor, the oppressed, the prisoner, what I call Jesus's preferred constituency, until you've heard that voice, you haven't heard from God yet. Because we know that God has a bias for the poor, the widow, the poor, the oppressed, and the widow. That's who Jesus hangs out with. That's where the Spirit is to be found. So the radical collaboration is making sure all those voices have been heard. And that's going to invite you to change your mind about something. You're going to reframe the way you think of it. While you're going through this process, you have to know what you're doing. You got to be mindful of process. And again, as designers, we're not thinking our way forward. We're not braining our way forward. We're living our way forward. Well, Christianity is a way. It's not the Christian think, it's the Christian walk. You're supposed to be moving. Christianity is a verb, not a noun. And that ends up with storytelling, which means, be prepared to give the testimony of the hope that lies within you. If you're living a life, if you're designing your way forward in a thoughtful way, you have a story to tell of what it is that God's doing in the world with and through and around you. Now, that turns into a specific process of actually getting something done. Looks like this. We tend to call it the caterpillar. It's a bunch of hexagons in a row. We've been teaching this for over 50 years. It starts with empathy. Thing one, the first question is not, what are we going to do here? The first question is simply, what's going on? Because the second step is definition of what is the problem worth solving? Or is there even a problem worth solving? Or are we the people who have something to offer in this situation? Design is fundamentally humble because it starts simply with, I don't even know if there's a soluble problem here. So after I've hung out with this thing deeply and humbly enough as an empathizer, and then I've defined what might be something we could do, and the critical elements of a definition for a designer would be, I've got a user, I've got a problem, and I've got an insight. There's somebody I can serve, there's something I can do, and I actually have something to offer here that we haven't seen before. I have an insight that might make a unique contribution. And then I start having ideas about how I could do that. And then I prototype it to learn my way into what might actually work. I don't start by delivering the solution. I start by knowing I don't know how to do this. And the only way to learn how is to try it, to go out and actually engage it. And then you test that until you let it go. And the step zero, by the way, which is terribly important, particularly when you're doing stuff with real human beings, you're messing with people's lives, is step zero, which is acceptance. Again, the empathy step and the definition step are about problem finding. We problem find before we problem solve. And by the way, and that's a profoundly important thing for discerning Christians. We can come back to that. But before you even do that, you have to accept that this is the way things are. Because you are here. There's this huge, big, red "you are here" bubble sign in the grad studio area at Stanford for this design students. Looks like a big, "you are here" locator at an airport. To remind the students, you have to start where you are. You cannot solve a problem you're not willing to have. Oh, I really should be doing this. We should have already had this figured out before. Like all that shoulding doesn't help at all. God doesn't live in the land of should. God lives in the land of is. It's reality where you get to find God, not in your imagined preference. So, again, design and Christianity get along just fine. You got to accept the way things are. So that really brings us, that's a real quick flyover of design thinking. I did a horrible job of that, but that's as fast as we can go. And that brings up, I think, some possible issues that might illustrate or illuminate some issues that I think are getting in the way of the church, particularly the Western church, which probably could learn some things about this from the global church. That's another story too. And I'll just sort of throw those issues on the table, and then we can have a conversation. So I think those issues are, we run into the need to be right. We run into a preference of content over context. That makes us people who tend to tell rather than listen. And I think we've ended up with an undue bias of helping manage sin instead of, foster new life. And so that's Dave's personal opinion, and I like to tell my consulting clients, have the bad news and the good news. The bad news is I'm really opinionated. I've got a really strong opinion. Good news is I'm right. So it's a little arrogant, but I've been at this a while, and I tend to bump into these things with well-meaning Christian leaders all the time, and I think it's getting in our way. So I'll just throw that out there, and we can have a conversation. What's on your mind, Lindsay?
Well, great. Thanks for giving us an overview. Like you said, we could really unpack all those different elements of the caterpillar probably for hours. But
oh yeah, we literally teach about a 60-hour course on that stuff. So we just barely read the labels.
Well, considering that the forum is only 24 hours and we're not the only content,
maybe something else you're going.
We'll speed it up for them. But I really liked how you ended with accepting the problem. And I think, do you think the church, or I guess, how would you, from your experience, rate the church on how they're doing at accepting the problem? Because what you said in that statement was, you can't solve a problem that you're not willing to have. And I don't know, maybe you could share, do you think the church really has a good, like a sober self-assessment of where they are and where we are in this point in time?
Yeah, I think there's, it's very well-meaning, right? But I don't think it's helpful. Eugene Peterson, sadly no longer with us, brilliant Christian mind, the guy that gave us the paraphrase called The Message, was talking once in an interview about this question, and he was actually talking in his 4 book series, including Under the Unpredictable Plant and what have you, which was his pastoral series. So I'm like, what does it mean to be a pastor? How do we do pastoring well? And he starts talking about spiritual direction, the ministry of spiritual direction. And he says, spiritual direction is exactly not what we're doing most of the time. He says, I'm a pastor, and what I'm going to do almost all the time is one of 2 things. I'm going to manage, or I'm going to care. When I encounter health, in my church, I walk up to somebody, here's this Lindsay. She's very talented. She got all this business experience. She's a bright, attractive woman. She's articulate. What can we do with Lindsay? What I'm going to do with her is I'm going to manage deploying your resource into the church's effort or into the world, because that's what I want to do. I want to get you out there. I want to get you effective. I'm going to manage you. Or, or I'm talking to Tommy. Well, Tommy's a piece of, Tommy's, he's a,
Yeah.
And there's need over there. I'm going to care for it. So if I'm a pastor, I've got this preemptive bias, like, am I managing you or caring for you? All of which comes out of my innate desire to help, right? Either you need to be helped or you could help somebody else. That's really what it's about. So which means I start with one of 2 answers. And Eugene Peterson would argue that spiritual direction's posture, and he's encouraging pastors to be walking around like he's spiritual director all the time. A spiritual director is incredibly humbly standing before the glory of the reality of the creation before him, called, any human being, waiting for an elevator. And I know that I have no idea yet what God is actually doing in your life. That incredible pain that you're in might be the gift of God, or it might be the totally unnecessary product of your, having been abused or oppressed, or of, frankly, the horrible decisions you're making, by taking all those drugs that you're taking. I don't know. You see C.S. Lewis's famous essay, The Weight of Glory. Every single human being that walks by you is bearing the weight of the glory of God on that incarnational instantiation that human being is, and trying to figure out how to live into it. If you could but really see who that person really is. So that's a kind of a long soliloquy, but my point is, how did we get here? I think we got here well-meaningly, and we're trying way too hard, too fast, because we're already looking for, how do I apply my both interest, desire, and capacity to help you, as opposed to simply start with what a designer would do, like, So I'm moving into ideation and prototyping like right away if I'm a good Christian person, as opposed to who are you? So it's the fundamental stance of humility.
And that was kind of my next question for you. What role does humility and honesty play in the design thinking process? I mean,
It's really
it
pretty
sounds like
huge.
it's foundational because one, you have to be honest with where you really are.
Right.
And then you would think the church would be a humble group, but really you can see how that's being challenged. Could you speak to that a little bit more about the role of humility in this design thinking?
Sure. Um, the two elements of humility that a designer needs to keep in mind all the time are, or two or three. Number one, I don't know. The job of the empathy step, right, is to uncover what's actually going on. And I have to start with the assumption that I'm absolutely going to find things that I didn't know I didn't know. I absolutely am going to expose my assumptions because there's stuff that I don't know that I know. And so my job now is to uncover that as candidly as I possibly can. In ethnographic research and there are formal scientific tools to learn how to de-bias yourself as powerfully as you can. And we know, from philosophy that there is no such thing as the objective point of view. You're never coming from nowhere, but you can be aware of where you're coming from, right? I mean, the whole dialogue right now going on worldwide around systemic racism is a classic example of this. Okay, so look, I'm a highly educated, situationally advantaged, Western white guy. The world works for me great, frankly. And I'm not a racist. I'm colorblind. I don't care. Thanks for sharing, Dave. Look, the absolute truth is, I do, if not prompted to the contrary, think of white as normal. Oh, there's a person, there's Lindsay. She's a regular person. She's a white person, and a person of color or a poor person or a person of another culture is, a person plus some other features. Normal plus these other changes from normal, because they're darker or they talk funny or, they don't eat the same kind of food I do. And so I'm wandering around presupposing that, I don't have a point of view when I do. And the church has to be aware of that. And that point of view, by the way, has earned it the right, at least in this country, where the unprompted branding, you go ask people, what is Christianity about? In front of a Safeway store and, without any prompting. And what you learn is the two dominant attributes of Christianity in North America are judgmentalism and narrow-mindedness. Who are Christians? Judgmental, narrow-minded people. What's that? What are judgmental, narrow-minded people doing? Well, they're looking through a small tunnel and they're starting with the answer because I'm judging you already. So I think that's the fundamental issue. Are you willing to not know? And as a Christian, I found the gospel. I know that, in fact, the more conservative a Christian I am, the more exclusively I think Christianity is the right answer. In fact, my particular version of Christianity is the right answer. Then I actually don't even need to find out where you're coming from because I got the truth and you don't. Let's go.
Right. So practically, this is a great discussion, but practically, what does the church do to change that? How do we start? How do we admit that we don't know? How do we hear, you listen, all these kind of Jesus constituents? How do we hear that voice? What does it practically look like for someone who might be listening from South America, South Africa, or in the southern, part of the United States? What can they listen to, finish this podcast or time together, and what could they actually go and do and, not necessarily have the solution, but where do they start?
Well, I might recommend that you will start individually in terms of what your own arrangement and organization of spiritual formation and discipleship looks like. And then that starts broadcasting into program development and program management. Because I mean, for the most part, what is the church? Well, it's a social program provider. It's selling hey, we've got this little entertainment show we do on Sunday morning. We call it a worship service, and we've got these classes we teach that are, about, family development. They're about personal development. They're in the personal development social program business.
Right. And we don't want to just create the next, committee that then
Right.
basically builds on the problem that we have.
Right. Yeah. So we tend to get, and frankly, this goes all the way back to Constantine. When Christianity won the day and became part of empire, it was no longer being persecuted and fighting for its life. It was now the lingua franca of power. And so now, we're not only allowed to grow, we're authorized to grow. And for a while there, unless you were one of us who put you to death at the point of the sword, when you get used to, and the Western church, still feels that. So like in America, now that we're in a post-Christianity, post-Christian society, people are really upset. Like, this isn't America anymore because it isn't Christian, like it never was. And frankly, it's a really good thing that we're separating church from power. But nonetheless, what do you do? If you start that personally, again, and I mean, so you begin your day with Lectio Divina, which is a way of praying the scriptures 4 ways, and you just read a passage 4 times and simply say, let not the idea of what God is trying to teach you that you're going to go apply that morning be understood by your brain, but you let the word be a place where the Spirit of God, can attend to you. So, I mean, we spend so much time as Christians. The first question of the day that most Christians tend to ask, or think their pastor is asking them to think about, is, what should I do today? How can I further the gospel today? Well, I appreciate that availability. But what I might really want to start with is simply, where's God? And am I or am I not being invited? So John 5:19, Jesus says, the Son can do only that which the Father shows him. Or as one of my mentors says, Jesus, the least creative man who ever lived, it was follow every darn day. And there's another phrase back from the 70s. I'm old. We used to say, are you running with me, Jesus? Which means I'm going to go do this thing for the Lord, and I hope God's with me. I mean, do you not notice thinking up something that deserves to be done and is consistent with Christian theology and the scripture is incredibly easy. There's tons of stuff that we need to get done. We're a long way from having fully realized God's dream for flourishing for humanity and all the creation. I mean, we're a long way from the New Jerusalem being up and running. So thinking up Christian stuff to do is trivially easy. And I don't know about you, but it's really pretty clear to me, God's moving on this project a lot more slowly than I would.
Right. My to-do list, I could just run through that very quickly.
Like, dude, if you want some suggestions, give me a call. Let's go. So, if you really want to be part of making the kingdom of God realized, it's easy to self-authorize.
Sure.
Here's the problem. One of the reasons so much Christian stuff fails, it's got everything going for it except Christ.
Right. We kind of get out in front, right?
We get out in front, well-meaningly, but frankly, pretty arrogantly. And so it has to start with, just because there's a need does not mean there's a call. Just because there's a could does not mean that there is a should. So we have to learn how to experience the reality of the presence of God making an invitation. When Jesus says, I do only what the Father shows me, it's not just a verse reference. How does God, we have to learn how to be shown of God what is going on in the world. So that first empathy step is not merely what's going on, but what's going on and where is God in it.
Sure.
And is that God saying, and I want, and Lindsay, you're the next one that I want to involve in this. So we need to be more discerning. So if I had to say one sentence, we need to be less intentional and more discerning. So
I was going to
I
ask
want
you
to
about
follow
this.
what God is actually doing, not just come up with what God should have been doing already.
That's a great lead into, because I was going to ask you, could you speak to discernment? And I heard you speak about this previously, but I think it ties in so nicely to this conversation. And, that's what people need to do, is to be able to discern. So could you speak to discernment and maybe the discernment process that you shared before?
Yeah, it's kind of my number one thing. If I were Solomon and I got given, you can have, or Aladdin's lamp, and I got given, you can have anything you want, I'd ask for discernment for sure. Perhaps one of my favorite things that Jesus ever said was, each day has enough trouble of its own, which is a really interesting thing to think about.
Right.
Because what it means is a terribly important thing to discern every day. Is that thing on your mind, is that today's trouble or tomorrow's?
Sure.
Because when Jesus says that, what he's saying is, don't sign up for trouble prematurely. That's what this faith thing is about. Like, we'll get to that tomorrow. Now, I do think that, even spiritually sensitive discernment includes forward thinking. The same Jesus that talked about, consider the birds of the air and the lilies of the field. They don't worry about this stuff. Like relax, get over all that anxiety stuff you're doing. He said all that. And he also said, what general before going into war does not sit down and count the cost? So that's a little bit of contingency planning. So that's all in there, but which is which and on what day? Mm-hmm. I mean, when is it time for me to think more like the lilies of the field, and when is it more time for me to think like, Dwight Eisenhower before D-Day? I mean, which is a lot of planning was involved. Right. I mean, so, you got to discern that. And what it absolutely does mean is there's lots of stuff that is not today's trouble. So literally, I can see that issue, I can see that problem, and you know what? It's not today's trouble. Not to be melodramatic about it, but 10 and a half months ago, my wife died. Mm-hmm. So my wife died of cancer. On March 2nd, she got a terminal diagnosis in 2020, and 12 days later, shelter in place started with COVID. It was a pretty interesting year. 9 months after that, she died. I'm obeying the conventional wisdom of don't make any big moves for a year. I mean, just get through it. I'm coming up on that. And so people say, well, gee, Dave, what are you going to do now? And I go, don't ask me. And they go, what do you mean? Well, who do I ask if not you? Kind of go, well, ask me next year. Well, why? Well, because he knows and I don't. Mm-hmm. Part of what God is doing in your life is growing you in. One of the things that I believe is underlying Jesus's admonition to only deal with today's trouble is not merely like, because you don't need more than you can bear, but also that trouble that's not yours yet today. God hasn't called you to solve that issue yet because you're not the one. I mean, tomorrow or next week, or in my case, 60 days from now, that guy can hear things from God, can see things from God, can respond with God in ways that you can't. God is always today building the person you might be tomorrow. I mean, Jesus, when Jesus got dressed up to go to the wedding at Cana, he really didn't think the public ministry was ready to go. By the time he went to bed, he did. Yeah. Just in time discernment was going on in Jesus's life, and he was perfect. I mean, he was wrong that morning. No, my time has not yet come. Oh, maybe it has. Yeah, it's come. I mean, so literally that's kind of an edgy interpretation, but nonetheless, we're dealing with real time here. So the number one thing we can do is, from a discernment point of view, is recognize that that's the way reality is. See, I believe most Christians are engineering thinkers, not design thinkers. They think they're supposed to solve the problem. And the fundamental problem today is, what do you need me to do? How do I advance the gospel today? That's not your job. Your job is to be an incarnation, to be an instantiation of the presence of the reality of God's forgiving love. And there might be and along the way, there might be something you need to get done today. But first and foremost, simply be a place where somebody might bump into you and kind of go, there's something going on with you that's not the same as these other people around me, as opposed to, we need to get going here. So discernment starts with that. And discernment has a posture of listening at all times and knows there's a lot of not knowing.
Mhm. Do you think one thing as you were speaking about that, you know, we just want to solve, we want to fix it.
Right.
And the reason I do it personally is because there's value in that. I feel
Sure.
valuable, right? When I can help or fix whatever. But then I'm so programmed that I then have, eliminated the margin out of my life because I'm so on track to, getting it all done that day, that then when the real need that the Lord brings right in front of me, I don't have time for that. I don't have time to listen. I don't have time
Right.
to invest. I don't have time to, like, I think you've said, lean into the leading because I'm so off onto my own program that day.
Right.
So, I think we find value, which again, it comes back to pride. That's me being proud and wanting
Right.
to make my contribution.
Yeah, I actually think it gets all the way down to the fundamental existential rationalization of your existence on the planet. I teach a class on success out of the book of Ecclesiastes. And I call it God's definition of success. And it's a 45-minute study, and we haven't got time for that either. So I'll spoil it and jump to the chase.
Okay,
and Ecclesiastes is kind of a weird book, and most Westerners in particular don't like it because it seems awfully depressing. And frankly, it seems schizophrenic. He's bouncing back and forth all the time. Like, yeah. What is he on, or what is he not on? He's not. He should be on meds. He's bipolar.
Mellow out, yeah.
It's a manic depressive book. There's a whole bunch of like cheerful stuff and a whole bunch of really depressed stuff, and they're all mixed up. And like, what's going on? But if you actually sort the book out, I've actually done that. I've sorted the book out for the Western mind. Like, here's all the verses about this thing, and here's all the verses about this. If you look at particularly relative to work in the world, into your role in the world, there's all this complaint about, I've seen what God has given people to be busy with and is chasing after one. And then you look at the things that Solomon observes as causing people to end up in existential despair. My life is worthless. They're doing things like, building and producing and reaching out and learning and trying to create fairness and legacy. I mean, I've got a list of 9 things that are in the book, and most of them are really great stuff. Most of these things you and I are working on most of the day. And Solomon has observed people who do that end up in total despair. Then there's this other thing I call the grand conclusion of Ecclesiastes, where you hear over and over and over again in a variety of ways. And he says, blah, 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 wine, 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 life sucks. But what I have seen, here is, enjoy, the wife of your youth, or enjoy the meal before you, for this is the gift of God. And we read that like it's the consolation prize. Like, okay, life really sucks, but hey, the coffee's not so bad.
Right.
I think that's what he's saying at all. He's literally saying, no, this way of living looks like this. And what I have seen over here is this very, very different thing. And he says in one place, particularly, fortunate are they who have, strength and power and the wisdom to enjoy them, for they'll not much remember the length of their days, having been preoccupied with joy in their heart. And so there's something about living in the graceful gratitude of the gift of life. And I actually believe if you put the whole book into a blender and distill it out the bottom, that Ecclesiastes is asking us one question: which kind of human are you? Number 1 or number 2? And number 1 person is a production-oriented person, where the outcome of what you've done in your life is what makes life worthwhile, i.e., what I got done today is why I am okay. That's person number 1. Person number 2 is the person who starts with gratefulness because God allowed them to be. And so they say, because I am already okay, once again today I get to go out and play in the field of the Lord and co-collaborate with God in this ongoing project called creation. So as a Christian, are you okay? Is your work, is your ministry, is your contribution to the world, is that what makes you okay? Or are you doing it as an expression because you are okay? I believe our work, if we are saved, we are truly saved, then you're fine, you're done. There's nothing more you can accomplish. And all you're doing is glorifying God by enjoying him forever, as the Westminster Catechism says, by expressing your belovedness in a way that would, of course, go and love what God loves, including redeeming it, renewing it, and refreshing it. But it's not this compulsive, I have to help you because I'm a helper. And if I didn't help today, then I didn't get it done. If I didn't get it done, I'm not okay. So we really do have to completely overcome our compulsive need to act out our Christianity to reconvince ourselves that we're okay. Do you believe God loves you? Because there's nothing you can do to make God love you more, and there's nothing you can do to make God love you less. And I hate to tell you, there's nothing, it's not about you.
Right.
A guy named Gerald May, who's an MD and a specialist in addiction theory, wrote a really good book called The Awakened Heart. And he makes the premise that addiction is exactly what we're all made for. The reason addiction is so powerful is it's intrinsically built into the human condition because it's the way God made you, because addiction means there's something you can't get enough of. In fact, you're even willing to completely sacrifice your freedom to get it. And you're supposed to be addicted to God. It turns out God's the only addictive substance that as soon as you become addicted to it, first thing it does is gives you your freedom back. That's why getting addicted is so damn dangerous, because all the other addictions, including being a productive Christian, by the way,
Sure,
will never give you your freedom back. And if you don't have any freedom in you, because it was for freedom that you were set free, then that attraction that Paul says is supposed to be coming out of you, and it says, be prepared at all times to give a testimony of the hope that lies within you. A testimony is by request, meaning somebody noticed the hopefulness in you and said, hey, Lindsay, I noticed you're like unduly hopeful. Could you tell me more about that? If that's the kind of question you're not getting unsolicited all the time, then there's not enough hope in you. If not enough hope in you, not enough freedom and love in you. Not enough freedom and love in you, you're living compulsively. And that means it's really about you. Even a really lovely compulsion, trying to be helpful,
sure.
is compulsion. And a free, saved, okay person isn't compulsive. So we have to learn to let ourselves be loved. And what Gerald May says in The Awakened Heart is we need to learn, go all the way back to your discernment. Discernment starts with, he says, standing and simply suffering the searing beams of God's love. That when you judge and say, well, Isaiah, these things are too wonderful for me. When you really, really stand in the love of God, it's almost intolerable. It's too much, and it's totally undeserved, and we don't want to receive it because I don't deserve it. No, you don't deserve it. And God, why are you loving me? Just because I do. So we really have to learn how to receive that love and be transformed by it. And then that will free us to be less compulsive ministers.
Something that I know the North American church definitely has a hard time on, and just ingrained in our culture here.
Yeah, what have you done for me? We're human doings. Hi, what do you do? What do you do? What do you do?
In the corporate workplace, you're only as good as the last thing that you do, and if you're constantly being evaluated. But knowing that our time is short, any final statements that you want to just share, because we have people from all over the world joining us,
Sure.
maybe some light that you see from the global church, or just maybe a charge, that as you have contemplated all of these things and try to tie it up nicely for us in 45 short minutes, anything else that you would want to leave?
Well, I will say, first of all, to those of you in the global church, thank you. Thank you for tolerating these incredibly presumptive, imperialistically minded white guys who've been at this a long, long time. And to all of us, be willing to learn from your neighbor.
Mm-hmm.
A very, very dear friend of mine from 50-year dear friend, just retired as the executive vice president of corporate development for World Vision. Came out of the business world and so worked with big corporations who give donations both in money, in kind, and in service to the largest nonprofit on the planet, World Vision. And he did that for 12 years. And he was continually humbled by the grace, the gift, and the wisdom of the global church. What they know, in Indonesia and in the Philippines and in Zimbabwe and, wherever, in India, that we don't. And he had such a hard time helping his particularly Western North American brethren get it.
Right.
And the essence of what those people were doing is it started with accepting powerlessness in many cases. They were not in cultures that were necessarily, predisposed to supporting them. And they were not necessarily resourced in ways that allowed them to do whatever they needed to do. And so and still were able to not think, oh, I guess God doesn't love me because I'm not powerful and I'm not beautifully resourced, but I know I'm loved and I can still express that love. So I think starting with a profound belovedness and the gratefulness for one's belovedness is intrinsically humble.
Yes.
And so I think that's the gift that's the essence of the gift that the global church has to offer us, is you can be of service respectfully, humbly, and gratefully, rather than presumptively and hyper competently. It's a very different stance, and it's something we need to learn.
Well, thank you so much for sharing with us today. I mean, I know I've been challenged, and I know the other viewers have been as well. So thanks so much. This was fun. Let's do it again sometime soon.
Good to be with you. And and look, I'm in the boat with everybody else. Anytime I'm pointing at you, 4 fingers are coming back looking at me. So I don't pretend to know any of this stuff. It's just I'm old enough to have seen some things and made a lot of mistakes myself. So, hopefully, tomorrow's another day for me too.
Yeah. Well, thanks for challenging us. We
All
appreciate
right.
it.
God bless. Take care.
Yep.